The night was pitch black, the only light coming from the full moon that hung heavily in the sky. I was driving down an old forest road, the kind that seems to stretch on forever, winding and turning with no end in sight. The radio was playing static, every station just white noise, as if the world outside had ceased to exist. Suddenly, the car sputtered and choked, the engine dying with a final gasp as I coasted to a stop. I tried the ignition, but it was futile. The car was dead, and I was alone, surrounded by the thick, oppressive darkness of the woods. I should have stayed in the car, waited for morning or for another soul to pass by. But something compelled me to step out, a whisper in the back of my mind urging me to venture into the forest. The trees seemed to close in around me, their branches like fingers reaching out to grab me. As I walked, the silence was deafening, broken only by the crunch of leaves underfoot and the occasional distant howl. I felt eyes on me, watching from the shadows, following my every move. My heart raced, my breaths coming in short, sharp gasps. Then I saw it, a faint light in the distance, a beacon of hope in the sea of darkness. I moved towards it, my steps quickening, desperate to escape the feeling of dread that clung to me like a second skin. But as I drew closer, the light began to move, darting between the trees, always just out of reach. I chased it, stumbling over roots and rocks, until I found myself standing before an old, abandoned house, its windows dark, the light I had been following nowhere to be seen. The door creaked open on its own, inviting me in. Against my better judgment, I stepped inside. The air was thick with the scent of decay, and I could hear the scurrying of unseen creatures in the walls. I should have run, but I was drawn deeper into the house, to a room where a single candle burned on a dusty table. And there, in the flickering light, I saw them, figures, pale and ghostly, their eyes hollow pits of despair. They whispered to me, their voices a chorus of sorrow and pain, telling me their stories, how they had been lured here just as I had, how they had never left. I tried to back away, but they were all around me, their cold hands gripping me, pulling me down. And then I woke up, back in my car, the engine purring softly. It was morning, the sun rising in the sky. It had been a dream, nothing more. But as I drove away, I couldn't shake the feeling that something had changed, that I had escaped with more than just my life. I glanced in the rearview mirror, and for a moment I saw them, the figures from the house, sitting in the back seat, their eyes empty and staring. Then they were gone, and I was alone again. But the whispering never stopped. The whispers were like a siren's call, luring me back to that forsaken road night after night. I tried to resist, but the pull was too strong. Each time I found myself behind the wheel, the moon casting long shadows through the trees, the road stretching out like a ribbon through the darkness. I knew I wasn't alone. The figures from my dream, the ones with the hollow eyes, they were with me. I could feel their presence, hear their whispers over the hum of the engine. They were a part of me now, a haunting melody that played on an endless loop in my mind. One night, as I drove, the car filled with a cold mist. It swirled around me, seeping into my bones, chilling me to the core. The radio crackled to life, a voice cutting through the static, singing a song I'd never heard, but somehow knew by heart. The road ended at the house, the same house from my dream. The door stood open, a gaping maw waiting to swallow me whole. I walked inside, the candle still burning on the table, its flame flickering in the draft. The figures were there, just as before, but they were different now. They were clearer, more solid, as if they had been feeding off my fear, growing stronger with each visit. They didn't need to whisper their stories anymore. I knew them all, tales of sorrow and loss that mirrored my own. I realized then that I wasn't the victim. I was the narrator, the keeper of their stories, the voice that would carry their tales into the world. I was the one who would keep the candle burning, who would keep the house alive with the memory of those who had been lost to the darkness. As I accepted my fate, The house began to fade, the walls dissolving into mist, until I was standing alone in the forest, the dawn light breaking through the trees. The car was gone, the road was gone, and I was free. But freedom came with a price. I could leave the forest, but I could never escape the whispers. They followed me, a constant reminder of the night, of the house, and of the stories that were now mine to tell. The Whitaker mansion loomed before me, its silhouette a jagged scar against the twilight sky. As an avid ghost hunter, I had heard the stories, the legends that shrouded this place in fear. They said the house was alive, that it breathed and hungered. I had laughed them off. Now, standing at its threshold, I wasn't laughing. The door groaned open at my touch, revealing a grand hall cloaked in shadows. My flashlight flickered, casting eerie shapes that danced along the walls. The air was stale, heavy with the scent of secrets long buried. I pressed on, my footsteps muffled by the thick layer of dust that carpeted the floor. I made my way to the parlor, where a grand piano sat, its keys yellowed with age. A sudden compulsion seized me, and I struck a note. The sound was discordant, a wail that seemed to echo from the very depths of the house. It was then that I heard it, a soft melody, a lullaby that seemed to seep from the walls themselves. Chilled to the bone, I followed the sound upstairs, each step creaking under my weight. The melody led me to a nursery, where a crib lay overturned, its bars twisted into grotesque shapes. The room was cold, far colder than the rest of the house, and I could see my breath form misty clouds in the air. As I turned to leave, a giggle pierced the silence, a child's giggle, full of mischief and malice. I spun around, my heart pounding, but the room was empty. The laughter grew louder, surrounding me, closing in. I fled, the sound chasing me down the hallways, through the rooms, a cacophony of madness. I found myself in the library, the walls lined with books that seemed to whisper their titles as I passed. And there, in the center of the room, stood a figure. It was a woman, her back to me, her hair a cascade of silver that shimmered in the dim light. I called out to her, but she didn't respond. I reached out, my hand trembling, and as I touched her shoulder, she turned. Her face was a void, a darkness that pulled at my soul, and her eyes were hollow, empty sockets that wept black tears. She spoke then, her voice a hiss that filled the room. "You do not belong here," she said. "This house is not for the living." I ran, the house seeming to stretch and warp around me. Doors appeared where there had been none. Staircases led to nowhere. The woman's laughter rang in my ears, a sound that was not human, not anymore. I don't remember how I escaped, how I found my way back to the world of the living, but I know that part of me stayed behind, trapped in the Whitaker mansion. And sometimes when the night is dark and the wind howls through the trees, I can hear the lullaby, the soft, sweet lullaby that calls me back to the house that breathes. The nights that followed were restless, filled with dreams of the Whitaker mansion and its ghostly inhabitants. I could not shake the feeling that the house was calling to me, beckoning me to return. And so, I did. I found myself once again at the gates, the mansion towering ominously against the starless night. The air was colder now, a biting chill that seemed to seep into my very bones. The gates swung open with a haunting screech, as if welcoming me back to its sinister embrace. Inside, the house was different. It was as if it had awakened, its halls alive with the echoes of the past. The portraits on the walls seemed to watch me with knowing eyes, their expressions twisted in silent screams. The piano in the parlor played on its own, the keys moving with ghostly precision. I climbed the staircase, the wood groaning under my weight. The nursery was just as I had left it, the crib still overturned. But now there were toys scattered across the floor, their eyes glowing with an unnatural light. The giggle returned, a sound that filled the room and made my skin crawl. I fled to the library, the whispers growing louder with each step. The books flew from their shelves, their pages flapping like the wings of caged birds desperate for freedom. And there she was, the woman with the void for a face, her presence a black hole that threatened to consume everything. "You cannot escape," she hissed, her voice a chilling wind that wrapped around me. "The house will not allow it." I ran, my breath ragged, my heart pounding in my chest. The mansion was a labyrinth, its corridors twisting and turning, leading me deeper into its dark heart. I stumbled into a ballroom, the chandelier swaying as if caught in a tempest. Shadows danced along the walls, taking on forms that were human and yet not. The music swelled, a haunting melody that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere. The figures from the portrait stepped out of their frames, their faces contorted in agony. They reached for me, their hands cold and clammy, their touch a promise of eternal suffering. I screamed, the sound lost in the cacophony of the house's madness. I was a prisoner, trapped in a story that had no end, a nightmare that would not cease. And then, silence. I awoke in my own bed, the morning sun streaming through the window. It was just a dream, a terrible, vivid dream. But as I looked down, I saw it, a single black feather on my pillow, a souvenir from a place that should not exist. The Whitaker mansion still stands, its doors closed, its secrets locked within. But sometimes when the moon is full and the wind whispers through the trees, I can hear the music, the laughter, and the cries of those who are forever bound to the house that breathes and waits.